Well, hello there, and welcome to our week 4 of organizational theory. So, for this week, we are going to be looking at a couple of key topics or key areas in uh, organizational theory. And the first one is looking at structure, looking at how organizations are structured, the different types of structures that organizations have. And then the second area of study that we'll be looking at is culture, which is extremely important when we are assessing and evaluating and trying to understand an organization. So, organizational culture is something that you are going to become aware of as you enter into the workforce and become exposed to the different organizational cultures that different organizations have, right? Alrighty, so let's get started. So again, we are going to be looking at organizational structure, and then chapter 7 is organizational culture. For this week, you have chapter 6 and chapter 7 as the two chapters for your readings, as far as the readings. Now, let me, before we get into the actual content of this week's material, let me take a moment to remind you that for this week, you have the readings, chapter 6 and chapter 7. You have a written assignment, which is a case study. Okay, please make sure that you do this. This is on time. This is due day 7. You have a discussion board, so a discussion question, day 7. And then last but not least, you have a test this week. That's also due on day 7. So please allocate your time appropriately and accordingly during the week, and organize your time so that you are able to finish everything on time. Okay? All right. And there's the last thing I wanted to make sure that you did get a chance to see, aside from my lecture, which I'm going to try this time and do it and make it a little bit shorter. I know that these lectures sometimes get really long. Aside from this lecture, there is a very good video that you should watch for this week, and it's on week 4. You will see it on week 4, and it's a video that talks about the importance of culture, of organizational culture, but the importance of culture and where does culture come from. We'll talk about that, okay, as we get into this presentation, the second part of it, which is the part about organizational culture, okay? So I just wanted to make sure that you do not overlook that video that you should watch for this week, week 4, okay? All right. So the functional structure of an organization, okay? What is the functional structure of an organization? Well, it's the functional structure is a design that groups people together based on something that they share in common. All right, so common expertise or experience, or because they use the same resources. Okay, so for example, you think about tobacco growers, right? They they are usually connected because they are all using the same resources, they have the same expertise or share some expertise, and they have an objective, a collective objective, which is to produce, say, for example, cigars. The functional structure is the bedrock of horizontal differentiation in an organization. So because it determines how wide or how horizontal an organization is, right? And again, because we're talking about the function, right? What is needed? What are the functions needed for the organization? And so, based on those functions, we determine what is appropriate for that organization as far as the structure is concerned. An organization groups tasks into functions to increase the effectiveness with which it achieves its goals. So again, organizations will not just decide, throw spaghetti at the wall and say, we're going to be horizontal and we're going to have 10 departments and we're going to have 25 people in each department. They generally don't do that. What organizations do is they first understand and they first determine what their needs are, what their objectives are, uh, and what resources they have to begin with. And then based on that, they will structure accordingly, right? Depending on the nature of the organization will determine the functional structure of the organization. If you have organizations that are private private sector organizations, they tend to have different types of structures than, say, public sector organizations. This has to do with the market, right, and the nature and the stakeholders, right? Maybe a public agency, for example, doesn't have to deal with middle managers or with selling products. So you may not have distribution channels, for example, to have to deal with logistics. A public agency might have to deal with just providing a service to the people, like, say, for example, Social Security. So the functional organization, the functional structure will be different based on the nature of the product or service being provided. So let's look at a common functional structure that we often find. And by the way, this class, when we talk about organizational theory, it's hard to talk about it in the academic sense without incorporating organizational structure and organizational theory in all types of organizations. And a lot of the times we talk about private sector organizations. Okay, like a CEO, for example, a chief executive officer would be the head of a private organization, like, say, IBM or Apple, right? We don't have CEOs in public sector organizations. We generally have a director or a central a secretary, like a secretary of defense, a secretary of state, right? And then of course we have the president. But it's a different function, it's a different structure. So when we think about the organizational functional structure, usually the first thing that comes to mind is a private sector organization, which has, like for example here, a CEO as the head. So you might have the CEO, and then you might have underneath the CEO the different branches or the different areas or the different departments within that organization, where you would often find a vice president or a manager of research and development, a manager of sales, a vice president for manufacturing, or a vice president for finance, or a chief financial officer, for example, would be somebody that would be underneath the CEO. Okay, so depends on what kind of functions and what kind of structure an organization has will determine who lies underneath, say, for example, the CEO. So what are some of the advantages of having a functional structure? Well, like any structure, whether you're talking about the human body, or you're talking about a family, or you're talking about an organization, it provides people with an opportunity to learn from one another and become more specialized and productive. Okay, because it gives you, I hate to use the same word, but it gives you structure, right? When we are in a family unit, where do we get our structure from? We get our structure from our parents, our grandparents, right? If we were lucky to have them, but we got, at some point, many of us got some structure from our grandparents, but we get it mostly from our parents. We get it from our siblings if we have, and we get it from all of the behaviors and systems and processes that go into that being part of that family unit, right? What are our expectations? what are parents' expectations, what are siblings' expectations. And so we get this structure from being part of a family. Well, when you're part of an organization, it's similar in the sense that you have an opportunity to learn from others, to become specialized in your role within that organization, and obviously gain from those relationships that you have from other folks around you. People who are grouped together by common skills can supervise one another and control each other's behavior. So this is another important positive or advantage of a functional structure. If you people that are in the finance department, generally speaking, understand finance. Usually, you would have masters in finance or accountants or MBAs, right? MBA types. And so, when you have these people with similar or common skills, they can kind of help each other out, but also check each other in the sense that if you make a mistake, somebody's there to say, hey, that's not right. That's not the way it's done. We don't do it that way, or we miss something, etc. So it does serve as an internal check of quality. It's quality control, which is a benefit from having that functional structure. And then this will become important when we talk about culture, is that people develop norms and values when they work together. That is the natural, that we call that sometimes institutionalization. When organizations begin, right, it's just an organization that begins is just what? An organization that begins, that starts together. It's just a group of people. But how does this group of people reach institutionalization? Well, it does so by working together, learning from each other, getting to know each other, and becoming a cohesive. Cohesion is a process that takes place in organizations, and cohesion means when people become very, very interconnected, and they think the same, and they work towards the same goals. They share the same or similar work ethic. They have similar values, right? You hear about people hiring the right people. You hear that, for example, in sports. You say, we want to hire the right person for the job. We are not so much interested in having the glamorous or fancy coach, for example. We want to have the right guy or the right gal for the job, because these are the people that are going to do what? They are going to create culture. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So that's why it's important to have a functional structure, because it will essentially allow those values and those norms to seep through from the leader down to the organization through its organizational functional structure. Now, what are some of the downsides sometimes, or I shouldn't say maybe downsides, but rather what are some of the limitations of having a functional structure, or even when you have a functional structure, there are things that you're going to end up experiencing in organizations. You often find that even when you have a structure in place, you still run into problems of communication or measurement or vision, okay? Maybe location. So your organization might be spread out around the country or throughout the world. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe, in fact, even within the same building. Okay, within the same building, you might have location problems, because these location problems lead to communication problems. You might also have problems that involve customers. Okay, and in the case of public organizations, these would be your constituents, right? The voters and the people. And then lastly, strategic problems, where you are not being strategic in your organizational execution. So you may not be taking into account risk. You may not be taking into account the potential future gains versus losses. So you may run into that. The function, the structure of the organization may not be serving you well, serving you as the leader or as a manager in giving you the best possible chance to be strategic. Maybe there's something about the structure of the organization that does not manage or does not allow you to manage risk, or does not allow you to provide the services to the customers. In the public sector, it would be your citizens in the most effective manner. So functional structure does not always mean that you're going to be successful, right? Having one doesn't always mean you're going to be successful. And the reason, and so when we are faced with this type of a predicament, we have to evaluate what the functional structure that we have is, so that we might consider another functional structure. So let's look at some of these different types of functional structures, right? We can go from going from functional structure to divisional structure. So it's no longer now looking at an organization that is set up based on the functions, but rather looking at the organization set on divisions, right? It's structured based on divisions. So, for example, functional structure is appropriate if the organization limits itself to producing a small number of similar products, okay, produces those products in one or a few locations, and sells them only to one general type of client. Well, if you think about these three, I don't want to say the requirements, but these three expectations about an organization that has a functional structure. Think about, for example, a public sector agency that has many constituents, all very different, very heterogeneous, right? People from all walks of life and needs and expectations. This would not be appropriate, because it is not selling to a small number of it's not selling a small number of similar products, right? It is not selling to only one general type of client or customer. In fact, it's selling to many different types of individuals. So, and of course, public sector organizations don't sell, but they provide services. Okay, so depending on the needs and the environment in which an organization finds itself, it will determine if a functional structure is appropriate, or perhaps it should seek a different type of way to go. So a divisional structure. Okay. So moving to a divisional structure, this is what happens is most commonly organizations adopt this type to solve problems when you have too many products, or too many regions, or too many customers, or too many different customers. Okay, and so this is one way to be able to manage this this type of a dynamic environment. So moving from a functional to a divisional structure. Sometimes a divisional structure is not the appropriate one, and instead organizations choose a product structure. Okay, and this is where you will design your structure according to the similarities or differences, and the products. Focusing on the products themselves. Okay. For example, each product division uses the service of the central support function, but each product division uh, does things differently depending on that one product. Okay, so it's divided into product-oriented teams. Okay, who focus on the needs of one particular product division. So, if one organization is selling products, say it's selling, um, I don't know, health insurance, and another one is selling life insurance. Well, the product structure will allow the health insurance branch to focus on the needs and the specific needs and the clients, etc., for that type of insurance, and the life insurance or yes, life insurance would focus on the needs of the life insurance client. So you would have a structure that is more aligned to the differences in products, not in the differences in divisions or function. There are other organizational structures that are also common in organizations, not so common as the product structure or the divisional structure, but you have multi-divisional structures. Okay, you also have, so you have multiple divisions here. You also have organizations that form in matrix form, so a matrix organizational function, which is what you see here on the top. The top picture here is a matrix type of organizational structure. As you can see, the matrix organization has essentially two. It has two sides, right? It's a matrix because it's interconnected, but you are responsible for relationships with, say, for example, upper management, but you're also responsible or linked with relationships that have to do with your own division or your own product, and so you essentially have interconnected roles in the organization, as you can see in this upper picture. Then you might also run into organizations that are hybrid, and a lot of organizations are hybrid because they have a little bit of both. A little bit of, say, for example, they might have in this case, sorry, see if I try to make it bigger. I can't make it bigger, but so in this case, you would have a CEO that manages a functional structure and a divisional structure. So a company with a hybrid organizational structure would be characterized by both, right? You would have a functional structure with say, for example, an HR director and a finance director, or a manager, a finance manager, or HR manager, and then you have a divisional structure where you have products. Okay, so that's broken down into product A, B, and C. So you do have these types of hybrid organizational structures also present for organizations. And then last one is network, and we see more of this now in today's highly technology-driven social media world, because because of the nature of social media, right? We have networks, we have technology networks, WhatsApp, WeChat, Facebook, what have you, right? Because the way information is spreads out, and the way information is communicated today, networks seem to work well sometimes with organizations, and especially because the traditional organization, right, the brick and mortar organization, has been replaced by the virtual or remote organization. So that organization has become much more network driven than in the past. So keep an eye on that. Okay, so this is we conclude here the part about organizational structure, and now let's talk a little bit about the culture, organizational culture. Okay, so creating and managing organizational culture. As I was saying, at the beginning, the video that you should watch for this week talks precisely about the importance of leadership in creating and managing organizational culture. the video is a great video, and at the end, it really comes down to one thing. What the video says is that uh, leaders are the ones that create the culture. An organization will usually follow the culture of his or her its leader, I should say. So if she is a strong, charismatic, transformational, and and situational leader, then you're going to develop a culture in the organization where understanding the environment becomes important, where understanding risk becomes important, where not being transactional in the way that you manage, rather being transformational. So taking into account people and people's differences, and people's taking into account diversity, and also being a communicator, right? If you have a leader that is a communicator, a leader that is an open door type of person, then that's the kind of culture that the organization will develop. And those are the types of people that are going to join that organization. On the other hand, if you have somebody that is an absent leader, right, or a very transactional leader who is only looking at reward or punishment, no, doesn't take into account the the situations and the differences in maturity of the workers, right, and capacity and learning and coaching. Well, you're going to get an organization that follows suit along those lines. So creating and managing organizational culture is driven by the leadership. And so that's why it's important to have strong leaders at the top, because they are the ones that are going to ultimately determine what kind of culture you end up with your organization. And we'll talk about ethics too, which is highly important, right? Okay, so what is organizational culture? So organizational culture is the sets of shared values and norms that controls organizational members' interactions, okay? So it's not, organizational culture is not necessarily image, no, even though image does have something to do with that, but organizational culture is what is expected. What is expected of workers, what is expected in terms of behavior, what is expected in terms of ethics, what is expected in terms of quality, what is expected in terms of effort, etc. Okay, so this is it is in many cases a source of competitive advantage. In fact, if you look at companies, that excel, that are very profitable and are long-term sustainable, versus the companies that seem to fall off, right, and go bankrupt, or you hear them in the news because they are engaged in some scandal. It has all to do with corporate culture. It has all to do with the organizational culture. Those that have sound organizational cultures tend to not be subjected to those types of situations. Organizational culture makes a company gives it that competitive advantage over its competitors. So what is organizational culture? The values, so general criteria, standards, okay, guiding principles that determine behavior, okay, how should we act in a certain situation, okay, a desired end state or outcome that people seek to achieve, all right, a desired mode of behavior. So you have terminal value and you have instrumental value. So, and this is important. What is it that we want from our organization? All right. Essentially, we are Coca-Cola. So, what is the mission of Coca-Cola? This is why Coca-Cola and successful organizations have mission statements, because the mission statement is exactly that. It's the end state or outcome that they seek to achieve. This is our mission. Okay, and then The instrumental value is how we are going to behave to achieve that mission, right? We're not going to cheat. We're not going to punish people or poison people or try to sell a product that is of less quality. No, we are going to do what the very best so that we achieve our mission, and that our mission is sustainable permanently, right? Indefinitely in the long run. Think about that in terms of the public sector, right? If you are for example, a new administration that comes into power in the United States, they should have a mission, and the mission should be to achieve A, B, and C, right? And so that should be the terminal value, the end state or outcome that they seek to achieve. How they are going to achieve it is the behavior, right? And this is where you see sometimes one administration being better than other. Sometimes the difference between a good president versus a great president versus a bad president. Okay, it has all to do with the culture that is established, and by the way, it comes from the very top. So if we see our current situation in the United States, the culture will usually come from the top, and so. And of course, it's not necessarily always the fault of the CEO or the president, but the person at the top, the leader at the top, is entrusted with the authority and the obligation to instill a culture that is both sound and effective, right? That is achieving that value that was intended at the beginning. All right, so let's look at these two, the terminal value and instrumental value. So these are the two main sources or the two types of values in an organization. So you have terminal value, desired end states or outcomes, right? So high quality and excellence. And then the instrumental values is how we are going to achieve that, because you can achieve sales by cheating, right? You can achieve profitability by being a slave, slave labor, having employing children, right? So, just the terminal value is insufficient. You need to have both terminal value and instrumental value, okay? And these are the two types of values that make up the organizational culture. Okay, organizational culture is based on enduring values. Okay, so. These are embodied in organizational norms, rules, procedures, and goals, right? So if you've worked, you know that when you begin a job, usually you're exposed to some kind of a training and maybe a little bit of history about the company or the organization. So after the training, you are probably, in fact, I almost expect that you'll have some kind of an employee handbook given to you, and you have to read it, and you have to acknowledge that you read it and that you understand it, and then sign. Well, this is the first step in communicating these values, these organizational norms and standards. Okay, so this is I guess a floor, but now that's not sufficient, right? Because what's on that employee handbook is not going to include everything about the organization. So it just gives you a base floor, right? A basis. People also draw on the cultural values that the organization instills and proclaims. So this guides their actions when faced with risk and uncertainty and ambiguity, right? How do you act? What is the right thing to do? Okay. What is expected of you, right? These are some of those unwritten rules that organizations have. And then the third thing about organizational culture is it influences members' behavior and responses to situations. This is why it's so important to have that strong leader who sets the example. Because, by the way, we are leaders when we don't have to be the lead, we don't have to be the manager, we don't have to be the supervisor in order to lead. Leadership is also manifested in followership. You could be an employee and be a leader, because leadership is a process. It's not a position or a or a it's not a position. It's not a role. In fact, it's a process of action. It's a process whereby you lead by doing certain things that add value to the organization. So when you have a leader that sets the example, just that by setting that example, the followers will follow on that example, and that will add value to the organization, because you're setting a good example, so people are going to do the same thing. If you are late to work, if the leader is late to work and is very lax about timeliness and about punctuality, you're likely going to develop a culture of very late, or very unpunctual people, right? You're going to see people coming to work late because, hey, if the leader is doing it, it's obviously accepted. So why not, right? So the influence that organizational culture has on behavior is tremendous, and the leader in that role plays a huge part in creating the right organizational culture. Now, organizations or countries or agencies don't live in a bubble, right? We live in an international environment. Organizations live in a corporate environment, and government works within a social and greater external environment. So we don't live in a bubble. Organizations don't function in a bubble. So organizations get as much from the outside, from the environment, as they do from inside. And what happens outside impacts directly the organization and the organizational culture. So it can have that impact. So a country's culture can affect the values and norms of a company or a company's culture. We see this, and I can tell you firsthand from having lived overseas, that companies that come from the U.S. who have followed stricter codes of ethics and behavior, etc., and then they come to other places around the world where laws and ethics are not enforced as strictly as they are in the U.S. And what they end up doing is they end up becoming a little bit more like the folks in those countries, right? And so you see some of this. But there's also other things that we should take into account, like differences in communication, in symbols, okay? Approaches to decision making. This has to do with the culture, right? For example, some countries still believe in collective decision making. Some countries are more collective than others. The Asian countries tend to be much more collective than, say, the United States. Latin America also tends to be a little bit more collective and perhaps more risk. They are more risk loving or risk seeking than, say, folks in the U.S. So it depends on the culture that will determine what kind the outside culture will impact the way that people make decisions and manage risk in some organizations. We should also be sensitive to the different communication styles and a country's culture norms. For example, when I was in China, I learned very quickly that when you hand something, a document of anything, whether it's a money or a business card or anything, you should hold it with two hands, as you see in this picture. It's the same in Japan. If you don't do that, it's a sign of disrespect, right? And so these are norms that most people wouldn't know, and really, it's not expected that you know them. This is why it's important for us to become culturally intelligent as much as we can, so that when we go overseas and work with different cultures, that we give off the right message, right? And vice versa, right? Other folks that come, say, to work in the U.S. should also understand the American culture, and not be not be misguided by what they might see in the news, which may not represent uh, everybody in the U.S., right? Because the United States is a very big country, 50 states, and we know that California is different than New York, and New York is different than Texas, and Texas is different than Florida, and of course the Dakotas, and you name it, right? So very different cultures, and so it's important to understand culture wherever you are in the planet. So again, recognizing differences in organizational cultures. Okay, we just to add on to what I was saying, many mergers between companies have failed because of differences in their organizational culture. This is why it's so important now to have these transition teams come together before the merger, because you have a company from China that's coming to the U.S. To build cars. You're going to have two cultures colliding, right? And so these mergers end up falling apart because of those collisions in organizational culture. And and by the way, they may both be very good, and they may both be excellent. The Chinese and the American counterparts may be great workers, but if they are not able to communicate their differences and to work together and to understand each of their cultural differences and idiosyncrasies, they're going to end up running into conflict. Now, as I was saying earlier, and I want to try and wrap this up because I know I've made my presentations long. Organizational culture is transmitted by whom? Well, it's transmitted by the members of the organization, but ultimately it comes from the top, okay? The leaders, okay? The leaders of the organization. A leader leads by example, whether or not I'm going to use she here, intends to or not, okay? So be careful what you do. Be careful how you are behaving and what kind of actions you take as a person of influence in an organization, because people are watching and you do lead by example. Okay? This process of socialization is the process whereby members begin to internalize, we call it. We internalize the values and norms of an organizational culture. Okay? Initially, folks, when they come into an organization, they might, we're always kind of, we feel a little shy and we're kind of getting used to the people and the environment and the organization. But as we get older and have more years under our belts in that organization, we actually begin to adapt and become part of the organization. This is the internalization process, where our values and our norms become aligned with the values and norms of the organization. Where does an organization's culture come from? We've said this already, but I just want to very briefly go through some of these. Organizational culture come from property rights system. We'll talk about those here in a minute. Organizational structure. So the type of structure also determines the culture. So and why is that? Because if you have a very vertical, organizational structure as opposed to a very horizontal one, this is going to have a difference. This is going to impact the way people communicate. Organizational ethics also plays into it, and the characteristics of the people. So this is why we take these Myers-Briggs tests, right? Personality tests when we come into an organization or when we go into an interview, because they want to know what kind of a person we are and if we are a good fit with that organization. So factors influencing the organization. I said I was going to talk about ethics, and I wanted to say something about ethics. That ethics, usually when we think about ethics, sometimes we can confuse ethics and morality. Morality is individual, right? My morals are my morals based on for example, my Christian morality, my Christian values, my family's morality, and the values that I have been instilled by my family and just me personally. But my morals may not be the same as somebody else's, right? Somebody may not have the same morals. But because we have different morals, doesn't mean that we cannot agree on an ethical code. What we cannot agree on ethics, on something that we both agree that is the right way to do things, to act. And so this is why companies have code of ethics, right? Organizational ethics, okay? In terms of truth, in terms of character, in terms of fairness, in terms of honor, and decency, right? And etiquette, and integrity. These are values that go beyond any kind of a religious or personal moral code. This is a code of ethics that we can all agree on, and organizations have their own code of ethics, and those codes of ethics are fed by society's ethics, right? Professional ethics. So, for example, in a medical doctor, right? The medical doctors have their own professional code of ethics, or engineers, for example, and or professors. And then your individual ethics, which are much kind of synonymous with your individual morals, okay? And so at the end, we kind of go back and forth with this question. So where does organizational culture comes from? Property rights. The property rights give the members of an organization limits. It gives them structure as to what is accepted, what is not accepted, right? What are our obligations for the worker, and what are the worker's obligations to us, okay? So culture comes from property rights, but that's just I guess you want to call it the functional part of organizational culture. The most important and most influential part, the distribution of those property rights, comes from the leaders, okay? Because it's one thing to tell you what is expected, what you can do, what you can't do, what's legal, what's not legal, what is expected and what is not expected. But really, at the end of the day, behavior is learned, and you are going to learn the behavior of the organization and the culture of the organization from its people, and particularly from its leaders. So culture is the shadow of the leader. So a good leader, a sound leader, an honest leader, a proactive leader, a fearless leader will instill that kind of a culture to the organization, right? And then the last thing, the last couple of points here about organizational culture is points on social responsibility. So, the importance of the environment, the external environment, not the physical, or it's not like pollution environment type thing, but the external environment. Okay, and by that, in that external environment, today's organizations have to be socially responsible. Okay, so it's part of being ethical, right? But also being socially responsible, in that these decisions are done in a way that is not harmful to others or to, say, the environment, right? To society. Okay, so for example, here with the LA skyline, right? Organizations and in fact governments. Okay, the LA city or the California, the state of California. We elect officials, we elect our governors, we elect our representatives to manage and handle these crises or handle these problems that are serious problems for cities like Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles. So, what is expected of these individuals, right? Should we expect them to do something about this, to promote legislation that will control smog or pollution, and maybe seek help from the state or federal government to help in that respect, or do we just let them be and not demand anything from them? And of course, they won't do anything if we don't demand anything from them, and so we continue with these problems. And so it depends on what kind of a response our leaders are going to have based on the needs and expectations that we as the workers or the citizens are going to demand from them. And that will have a lot to do with whether they become socially responsible or not. But social responsibility is an important element that needs to be embedded in organizational culture. Okay, and of course, with social responsibility, as I was just saying, you can take various approaches. You can take the I don't do anything, I won't do anything, and just completely ignore the problem approach, in which case you would be looking at an obstructionist approach. Simply, I don't care, and look the other way. You could also take the defensive approach, which is, don't blame me for this. This is not my fault, right? And then, so in terms of social responsibility, very low. That's the absent leader who refuses to be held accountable and take responsibility for those problems. Then there's the other side of social responsibility, which is the accommodative approach, which is, okay, how do I navigate in this reality that I'm in and try to make the best of it and try to work out, try to find a solution that will keep me in position. It won't affect me, but it will not make things worse, but not necessarily better. And then the one that we seek, the one that we should promote, and the one that we should be demanding is a proactive approach, where we're actually taking action. We are doing something about it. These are the strong leaders, the effective leaders, the proactive leaders who are not going to just let things continue the same and just watch things happen. And these are the people that are going to make a change. These are the change makers in society. Okay? Alrighty. And of course, this concludes the presentation. And I'm sorry, we're at 51 minutes, and I apologize. It's impossible to get everything in and cover so much material. But at least I hope that you're getting some benefit from these presentations and that you're enjoying them. I leave you with this psalm. Unless the Lord builds the house, right? Those who build it labor in vain. Okay. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. So the Lord needs to be when we think about our culture and organizational culture. What is our own culture in our family? What kind of a family culture do we have? Right? Is it a culture that has Christ at the center, that has God at the center, or is it a culture that doesn't? Right? And so think about this in your own personal and family organization, but also think about if you're a leader, if you work in an organization or the state, what would you like to see from that organization? What would you like to be? What kind of objective would you like to see that organization pursue? Right. So build things, build the house, provide the services and the needs for the people, and sell things and make a profit, but do so in a manner that is socially responsible and in a manner that is ethical and tries at least to achieve a moral outcome as well. So I leave you with that. Again, thank you very much. God bless you, and enjoy the week.